Hello students, welcome to your Week 10 highlights video. So in this video, I'm going to discuss an article by Bernadette Longo that explores a participatory design project in which she was engaged in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I hope you found this article compelling. I found it problematic on a number of levels, not that I quibble with her work or her goals necessarily, but I think there are many concepts related to this kind of study that she doesn't really take on directly that sort of form the subtext of the message that she ends up sending concerning the quote-unquote failure of her project. I just sort of feel like maybe we're not getting the whole story of the study and that we're not sort of dealing with the hierarchical or perhaps hegemonic assumptions that guide this sort of work across people coming from countries with more technological power and historical or sort of quasi-imperial histories when dealing with countries that historically have had less power and less access to resources. So some of those issues, I think, reverberate beneath the scholarly article narrative that is being shaped in this text and that perhaps are obscured by the traditional scholarly article format of this article. I am a fan of Longo's work in many other contexts, and I actually think that this is a really valuable article to read, and I hope that you all found it to be so as well. So let's get into some of the more salient concepts that I thought were important for us to consider in reading this. So as I say in this first bullet point, this is a very powerful study about participatory design, which is historically linked to the emergence of user-centered design across cultural contexts. She mentions the history of this as emerging out of Scandinavian UCD and usability decades ago, and participatory design has gained considerable traction. And it's interesting that she was doing this study, well over a decade ago in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It started in the Midwest of the United States at her university, but then she was able, through a personal relationship, to actually go to Africa to conduct this study that ended up being frustrated in its ultimate goals for a lot of reasons. So I'd love to know, I'd love you to think about whether your attitude about Longo and her students' project and their goals and suggested solutions changed from the beginning of the article to the end. I think this is an article in which she's quite frank about the overall importance of work that doesn't necessarily turn out the way that we thought it would. And I think it's actually pretty courageous that she brought this project into print because she does open herself to criticism concerning some of the assumptions that maybe she had when she went into the research and some of the pitfalls that she encountered while doing the project in a country that perhaps she didn't know enough about or wasn't a member of the community that she and her students were studying. So I think it opens up some really crucial conversations. So on the screen here, I actually have a relatively recent image from the Design Lab at MIT of projects that they do with NGOs in Uganda, which is a neighbor of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I shared this image because I wanted to reinforce that people involved in design and design thinking and usability, participatory design, they're still involved in the kind of work that Longo discusses in her article from over a decade ago. I mean, her project was over a decade ago, but the article isn't quite a decade old, I don't think. But I wanted this image to be resonant to say that these kinds of partnerships persist. Anyway, so Longo states early on that the challenge to establish trusted communication networks was the most profound design issue we faced. She means in the design of her study. She talks about high context and low context cultures. Those are concepts that our undergraduate students actually engage with in English 2210, which is our core curriculum class in technical writing. Our textbook actually covers these concepts, and they're an important guideline when people are doing intercultural technical communication. Ranging from writing documentation for a product that emerges out of a culture that is very different contextually from your own, to doing actual situated studies like the one that Longo is discussing. So relatedly, I'd like to know what evidence from her description of her students' and colleagues' proposed solutions reaffirmed that machine logic is necessarily low context. And so she's relating this to the technologies that they were proposing to introduce to resolve or intervene into some of the problems that existed in these communities, these women-led small businesses, or in the artisanal mining situation, which was the second scenario that she discusses in her study. So participatory design projects must involve, quote, the voices of people whose identities, lives, and social positions will be affected by the designs. That seems really obvious, but it often is hard to ensure and gets sidelined. So this is a way of saying, as she does, that the human must be centered in human-centered design. I'm very curious what your take is on Longo's project ultimately failing, as she says. Do you sense any problematic initial assumptions? I mentioned some of these perhaps at the beginning of this video on her part that she does not directly acknowledge here. And are there any ways around such problems in other studies? I mean, I don't think she's saying that scholars and researchers should not attempt projects like hers, and clearly the design lab at MIT and many other places are still doing this. But how do they protect against such failings? How do they protect against perhaps sidelining the specific humans that are at the center of the project or endeavor that they're dealing with? How do we protect against that when we are from a very different cultural context, perhaps, than the group that we are working with and working on the behalf of, actually? Sometimes in community engaged learning, which we do in some of our undergraduate 2210 classes, we always try to insist with students that even communities within our own city or in our own neighborhood, discourse communities, they might be quite different in terms of contextual cues from the one that we grew up in. So we always have to acknowledge these differences and their impact on our design projects. So this quote might seem to make an obvious point, but I feel it is important to bring powerfully forward again. She writes, a cultural study case is necessarily situated, partial, and influenced by the researcher. It is a representation of reality constructed at a particular place and time, end quote. So she puts herself, specifically her own persona, her own self at play in the study and its progress forward and its ultimate, as she says, failure. So what were the failings in Longo's scientific research design? Do you have any ideas about that? And the last point on this slide is, what did Longo learn about aiming to introduce technological solutions in contexts where existing power relationships could have been disrupted? She talks about context-specific dynamics, such as access to money, political power, other sort of resource facts that couldn't be addressed by the technological solution that seemed to be the default of her Euro-American college context and her colleagues and her students and the like that were being proposed to intervene into this context that was very different than the one she was emerging out of. So finally, how do technical communication researchers surmount their own cultural and technological heritage when working in cross-cultural contexts? This is really a crucial question. It's kind of a baseline question. And maybe I phrased it incorrectly here. Maybe we don't need to surmount our cultural and technological heritage, but maybe we need to think about, is there a way to, in a more sort of candid and stripped down fashion, expose ourselves openly to other cultural and technological contexts and heritages and be led by those scenarios rather than coming in with preconceived notions of solutions. So on that note, the video has come to an end. I hope it's been thought-provoking as the article was, and I hope that some of these concepts really impact you and guide the work that you do in usability and user-centered design in the future.